Everybody, how are you doing today? It's very nice to have you here. And our 3-week intensive is beginning this Sunday, and I wanted to speak a little bit more about the meaning of there is no separation. The only reason that we experience ourselves as separate, or that we experience that there is a separation, is because we identify ourselves as this body-mind. So once you identify yourself as an object that arises here, as the body-mind, then of course you also experience everything else as separate, as other objects. And that identification, believe it or not, it is a habit. We just have been doing this for so long, millions and millions of years. We have been identifying ourselves as this object, as the body, as the mind, as the sense of I, that we simply got used to that. And so now it's almost automatic. You don't even notice that anymore. You know, like with any other habit, like when you learn to drive a car, in the beginning, you are aware of every little detail that you have to do in order to drive. And then eventually all these details really sink into the subconscious, and you're not aware anymore of everything all the time. When you are driving, it becomes almost automatic, right? And so same with that identification. And I say almost automatic because there really is still a little bit of a gap, or that possibility to see it. You know, when you are going to sleep at night, there's that moment in which we have to let go of everything in order to fall asleep. You know, in order for the mind to move from the waking state into the dream state and into deep sleep, there's a moment in which you can't think about anything. You can't keep anything. You can't hold on to any possessions, to any relationships, to anything. You just have to let go. And also, same thing happens in the morning. You know, after the mind has rested in the deep sleep, the mind rests in the bliss of our true nature. That is why we are rested. That is why we wake up in the morning and we say we have a good night of sleep. And even if we didn't have a good night of sleep, there's still awareness, right? There's still awareness of that. Again, we are not always conscious of that awareness. However, how else would we know? Like when you wake up in the morning, how else would you know, oh, I had a good night's sleep, or I didn't have a good night's sleep? How would we know that if there was no awareness? So that process repeats itself in the morning in reverse. So now the mind rises from the bliss of our true nature. And through the dream state, it moves into the waking state. And that's the moment in the morning when you wake up, right? When your eyes open, when you're awake, when you're noticing that you are awake. And as that happens, there's still that moment there also. Moment or moments where that identification didn't establish itself fully yet again. There's that moment or moments where you can still notice the spaciousness from which everything arises. Where you can notice, you know, before the identification, before the mind or the identification with the mind, with the sense of I, with the body, re-establishes itself. And of course, you know, we want to be able to be aware of that while awake, and that is what is called meditation. You know, being aware of that in which everything arises, being aware of that natural state that we are while awake, that is really called meditation. And so even right now, you know, and going back to that habit, you know, it's a habit. If you really, really know that, It's like any other habit. Now, because you have been doing this for so long, now you crave doing that, or you just simply, there's that momentum to do it. But however, that habit can be broken. We can break that habit like any other habit, right? And the breaking of it begins with the awareness that, instead of just focusing on the objects, because that's how we perceive ourselves, that's how you perceive yourself, as an object. So now when you look around internally and externally, you perceive other objects. So instead of focusing on objects, we can really we can choose to focus on the substratum, on the spaciousness from which everything arises. So even right now, as we are sitting here, we can always start with a good sense of just the body and sensation and your feet on the ground, because that helps the nervous system and brain, right? We don't want it to be in overwhelm or resistance. We want it to be in good regulation, and we want it to, really function well as we are doing this. So take a moment, sit with your eyes open. Notice your body. Notice the sensations that are present. Notice your feet on the ground. Good, good, beautiful. And so, that helps a little bit the nervous system and brain to be a little bit more here. However, even right now, we want to really shift our attention. And so you can begin with some objects that are closer to you, visually closer or spatially closer. And just take a moment and focus on the object or objects. And then take a moment and focus on the spaciousness in which the objects exist. Good, good, beautiful, because that spaciousness, that substratum, it is always present. Lovely, beautiful. And it is really a matter of habit, and the same with inner, quote unquote, inner, because there's no inner and outer, but for the sake of communication, inner objects like thought, feeling, sensation, emotion. And outer objects, whatever you see with your eyes or sense or perceive, you can practice that. Instead of focusing on the object itself, even on thought, you can notice the spaciousness in which that thought exists. Good, good, beautiful. You can notice that substratum from which everything arises. And you see, that substratum is really the beginning, the middle, and the end of everything, right? So everything arises here. Everything arises from that. Everything exists in that substratum, and then everything subsides back into that substratum as well. And when you are really here, when you have the moment that your attention really is going inward, when you are not for a moment paying attention to thought, feeling, sensation, emotion, or any other objects that are present in your experience. Beautiful. Then naturally you become aware of that spaciousness, of that substratum that is always here. And you also naturally become aware eventually that, you know, in that spaciousness, there are no distinctions, there are no objects, there are no separate things that exist here, right? That really is just the function of identifying yourself as this body mind. So I want to invite you to join me in this upcoming 3-week program where we'll speak about this and about embodiment and what is embodiment of presence.